wanted to talk a little bit about emotions and some of these deeper sensations, these deeper feelings, and really the importance that we are able to go into all of our spaces and use the light of our own awareness, of our own consciousness to actually navigate into these spaces. Often I find that there's a certain kind of repulsion that's happening with these heavier emotions. And because, of course, when we are taught by adults who don't know how to access and process and transform and transmute their emotions, and they also are not able to be with themselves in that, either using escape mechanisms, numbing out. It thinks that I think at this point as a society, we get the different ways that we escape actually sitting and looking and owning, navigating and allowing healing and restoration to happen. So we as children inherit these patterns of escaping, of numbing out, of not looking in certain ways, either consciously or unconsciously. And if they're unconscious, then of course, words might be more difficult to, find, to be able to bring awareness into what would be commonly known as a blind spot. So something that I've been sitting with recently is sorrow. And often when I feel sorrow, when it arises for me, is when I observe the sense of separation of something that I recognize that I've done, and that I lament within myself. And there's a gravity to this sorrow. Now, sorrow itself is free from a story, meaning when I connect with sorrow, I feel what the experience is of sorrow in my body. And it can tell me a story. It can say why it's there, but that's not what I'm listening for. When I'm in the sorrow, as the sorrow, and I'm bringing the light of my awareness, when I'm bringing the fullness of myself, and what is the fullness? That means that there's no escape. Like I'm not the I of the fullness and the totality is moving into this space of expression, this space of movement, of a sensorial experience. It's vibrating. In this case, the word for me is sorrow. I'm bringing the fullness by surrendering the need to create something with it, do something with it, to move into or move out of it, to surrender myself into the experience of what's arising in that, and allow the fullness of that experience, that vibrational awareness, to speak to me. Why is this important? I think it's a really good question, because who within their own willfulness says, I would love to feel sorrow? Right? I would love to feel some of these heavier emotions that arise within our human experience. And it makes so much sense, right? And especially, it takes a lot of presence to sit in some of these spaces. And I already see that I'm moved. I'm moved emotionally. It really takes a real act, a real desire, a holy, sacred desire to want to know truth. Not the little self-created truth, but the real truth of the wholeness. So when this arises like sorrow, the meaning-making mind, the analytical mind, is part of the condition that separates. It's not the discerning mind. It's a habitual mind, and it moves away from discomfort and has a story about it. So it perpetuates by its own nature more separation, more moving away from, more ideas of other, of it, of not self. So moving into sorrow and feeling what arises within the field of sorrow, what unravels within that is paying attention to what's arising. In my case, the sorrow that is within the experience in that moment, then feeling the lament of the I that's making these choices, then recognizing that the I, who is by nature innocent, right? There's in this space, there's not the one who's intentionally doing, there's the one who's habitually orienting itself because of patterning, right? Because of not moving in and understanding the nature of this. It has, because of moving itself away from itself and creating more almost layers. Or if we were a tree and something happens and it hurts and we don't reconcile the hurt with the fullness, it can distort and the branch can be created from this main trunk. And the branch then starts to grow off, from its own. This is feeding this, but this is taking life also from the potency of this. This is starting to grow. And this branch, by feeding, if we don't catch it and cut it off so that the flow continues upward, we end up with each experience that's stuck, distorting and moving away. And the more we feed it, that distortion, the more it grows, the thicker it grows, right? And the more energy it takes away from the purity of the column of the fullness. And just imagine, I'm going to give you a great visual. Just imagine that at some point, these branches are there's so many ways that we have not reconciled the distortions, right? These ideas of separation, this other thinking, that our energy starts to move in ways, right? Or gets stuck where it's thicker over here and thinner over here. No, that's from resistance. right? Resistance to sitting and being with and allowing life to reconcile itself, meaning we don't need the mind, the habituated mind that separates, that analyzes, that dissects itself to discover itself. It's fun. Like a surgeon going into a scalpel and getting into discerning nuances. All of life is created by this. It's not created by, it's in the flow of this wheel of dissecting and analyzing to move into self within the self, to be able to see. But that self of dissecting, right, is still full of the self that is without the dissecting. It's just that within this self of dissecting is a completely different experience from the fullness of living in the fullness of self. And the freedom to navigate then, to be able to move up and down your own trunk freely, right? To relate with any level of awareness and consciousness without sticking, without getting stuck somewhere and making that part the whole, is an important awareness within freedom. Which is why surrender is so important. In reality, it's a superpower. Because life, as life is, it's happening. Life is happening. Sorrow is a frequency that's asking for attention within the fullness of life. To not tend to something that's arising. Now, tending itself could mean something as simply as observing it and allowing it to be there. That can be tending. An example of not tending would be to deny its existence, right? To suppress it, to put it in that Pandora's box and accumulate to where we remember that tree, those branches, right? Distort. To tend to. And that loving tending is bringing awareness from the fullness of self into that space and illuminating it. In sorrow, there's the I. There's the human I that's having the experience. There's also the greater sense of I awareness that's holding the totality of the experience, where the sorrow and the I, the small I who's having the experience, the one named Courtney, in her sorrow is having that experience, and the one who's holding the whole of the experience are not separate. When the I and the I are one, in the totality of the I, there's not a judgment about the smallness of the I, because the totality of the I is not separate. That would be like self judging itself. The small I judging itself for being itself. Now, that is a condition of the world in a way of how the habituated mind that's perpetuated until we stop and we observe. And we make a practice out of observation and witnessing what's arising and choosing what we give value to within the world, the habituated mind, or the totality of the experience. And even in that, there's no hierarchy of value. It's all valued. Is to then be in trust. So when we can allow the totality of our experience, for us to be in our sorrow and to allow the light of awareness to sit in, my experience is to bring the light of awareness and sit in the density of some of these emotions in a way can feel like what I imagine hell to feel like. The intensity of the burning of the unconsciousness. These are my words. The burning of the layers that have been built upon it while sitting in the center and the purity of it, allowing itself and all of those layers to be consumed by the light of awareness, the light of the fullness and wholeness and sacredness and holiness, the totality of all of it as one, the potency of this sacred life force moving into this space and burning away all that's not true. To be in the space of witnessing the happenings of this burning, to allow the burnings to take place, to feel the feelings of what that vibration does at that level of creation, separate from the whole. And yet complete in the fullness of the totality of expression. Then the burning of this away, this purifying of all the layers that are keeping it separate from the totality of the self, is to take it like love, hold it, allow it to do its thing, whatever that thing is. Complete acceptance and allowing. And watch. At some point, it gets lighter and easier. And it integrates back into the whole. What does that mean? It stops being a source of pulling attention to it because of its pain or its density. And we stop giving it attention in a way that's distracting us, pulling all of our awareness to it, where we lose sight of the totality of us, because that's what happens when we have these the pain and the distortion, could call some of this trauma where the mind gets tense. It has a belief structure that is solidified. It potentially interconnected, often it is, right? And we have valued this story. And so healing, per se, integration work happens when we can stay big. Because when we're in separation and we believe the stories of separation, we're not in the fullness and the totality of our own divine expression. We're always in divine expression, right? Potency of our divine expression, the purity of our divine expression, the source of our divine expression, in what we have the access to. Matters in the purity of our will aligning. And that sounds willful. And yet the paradox is us choosing. Choosing alignment, it means also surrendering that will to the greater will of the unknown that will go into every density in space that is contracted within us. And all we have to do as the small one is get out of the way. In a way, lose our self, small I identity and allow ourselves to merge back with the fullness of the whole of ourselves. So then each emotion is a teacher within our human experience, where we can relate with different layers and levels of awareness within the world, but we're no longer pulled or tempted to leave ourselves to create stories or perpetuate stories that add and contribute to our own suffering. We recognize the limitation of the story making and the story maker. Then when we are out of alignment, that's not a judgment. That is a vibrational, sensorial experience. The feeling of, oh, I chose wrong. In a Christian framework, sin means to miss the mark. So when we miss the mark, we aim again. And it's as simple as seeing it, looking at it, getting how we feel when we're not in our highest. And we choose again. If we move into guilt when we miss the mark, right? Then it's guilt that we're looking at as the smallness and bringing the light of awareness into that, right? Because guilt is not in the fullness. And if we looked at life as we're supposed to know everything, then we all would already know everything if we're supposed to know everything. And yet the one within us does know everything. So to start living in these paradoxes, where we're not pulled by our own dual thinking, where it's this or this, we start healing and reconciling the both and. in the totality of our whole existence and also our individual existence that really believes itself to be separate. And really, in each and every micro moment is unique. Where the coherency of the mind would make a movie out of it, it's also individual frames, like snapshots in each moment that are complete in and of themselves into the next moment, into the next moment. Right? Both and. So the next time an emotion's arising, fear not. There's nothing wrong. It's an opportunity to deepen in your connection, in your intimacy with yourself. And if that feels overwhelming for you, which I can understand, I know that and have known that too, reach out for support, someone who can be with you in that experience. 2, for the highest good, as one in the highest good. Thank you for being with me.